The air in the city general emergency room was a toxic cocktail. It tasted of antiseptic, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of fear. For Alara Vance, it was the taste of anonymity, a flavor she had cultivated for 2 long years. She moved through the chaos with a practiced slowness, her steps deliberately hesitant, her shoulders perpetually slumped. They called her Mouse, a nickname coined by the department's reigning tyrant, Dr. Alistair Finch. It had stuck, embraced by the sycophants and tolerated by the cowards. Alara never reacted. She simply absorbed it, another layer in the quiet, unremarkable camouflage she wore like a second skin. Her uniform was always a size too big, hiding the lean, corded muscle beneath. Her hair, a nondescript brown, was always pulled back in a severe, unflattering bun. She kept her eyes downcast, focusing on the scuffed linoleum floors, on the wheels of gurneys, on anything but the judgmental eyes of her colleagues. They saw a woman who was slow on the uptake, clumsy with IV lines, and liable to flinch at the raised voice of a frustrated patient. They saw weakness. They saw exactly what she wanted them to see. It was a miserable existence, but it was a quiet one. And after the screaming chaos of her past, quiet was all she had ever wanted. Dr. Alistair Finch swept through the ER like a minor god descending from a sterile Olympus. He was brilliant, a fact he never let anyone forget. His diagnoses were swift, his hands in surgery were legendary, and his ego was a tangible force that sucked the oxygen from any room he entered. He moved with an aura of untouchable privilege, his tailored scrubs crisp, his expensive watch flashing under the harsh fluorescent lights. He saw the ER not as a place to heal, but as a kingdom, and everyone in it was either a loyal subject or a peasant to be crushed underfoot. Alara was, in his eyes, less than a peasant. She was an inconvenience, a piece of hospital equipment that wasn't functioning up to his exacting standards. He seemed to take a special, cruel pleasure in pointing out her perceived flaws. He would do it publicly, his voice a blade that cut through the emergency room din, ensuring the maximum audience for her humiliation. He would grab a chart from her hands, scoffing at her notes. He would redo an IV she had just placed, tutting about her incompetence. Each jab, each insult, was a small price to pay for her anonymity. She would just nod, whisper an apology, and fade back into the background. Today was no different. A multi-car pileup on the interstate had flooded the bays with patients. The air was thick with the cries of the injured and the frantic shouts of medics. Alara was trying to get a blood pressure reading on a frightened elderly woman when Finch appeared at her side. He didn't speak to her. He addressed the room. "Can someone who actually knows how to use a blood pressure cuff take over here? We need this bed, and Nurse Vance seems to be attempting to solve a Rubik's Cube." A few of the other nurses snickered. Brenda, the charge nurse who orbited Finch like a hungry moon, smirked openly. "I'll take it, doctor." She bustled forward, pushing Alara aside with a hip check. Alara stumbled, catching herself on the bed rail. She saw the pity in the elderly patient's eyes, and it stung more than the laughter. She also saw a flicker of discomfort on the face of Chloe, a young nurse who was always kind to her in the break room, but fell silent whenever Finch was near. "Vance." Finch's voice was sharp, dripping with disdain. "If you can't handle triage, go restock the supply closets. Try not to drop anything. The boxes can be heavy." He turned his back on her, a dismissal so complete it was like she had ceased to exist. Alara felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks, the shame coiling in her gut. She clenched her right hand, her knuckles brushing against the faint, silvery scar that snaked from her wrist to her forearm, a relic from a different life. She took a slow, deliberate breath, forcing the anger down. This was the price. This was the penance. She turned without a word and walked toward the supply closets, the sound of her colleagues' whispers following her like a shroud. She spent the next hour in the sterile silence of the closet, her movements methodical. She counted gauze pads, sorted syringes, and stacked boxes of sterile gloves. Each repetitive action was a meditation, a way to rebuild the walls around her. She wasn't Nurse Vance, the clumsy fool. She was no one. A ghost in beige scrubs. It was safer this way. The world couldn't touch her if it didn't see her. The ghosts of her past couldn't find her if she made no noise. Here, surrounded by shelves of medical supplies, she could almost believe it was true. The quiet was a balm, a temporary reprieve from the constant, low-grade humiliation of her new life. But the quiet was not destined to last. A code blue blared over the intercom, a frantic, synthetic heartbeat that signaled imminent death. It was followed by a more specific call. All available staff to Trauma Bay 1. All available staff to Trauma Bay 1. Alara felt a deep, instinctual pull, a phantom limb aching for action. It was a feeling she had ruthlessly suppressed for 2 years. She ignored it, continuing to line up rolls of medical tape with painstaking precision. She wasn't a part of that world anymore. She was the woman who restocked the closets. Then the doors to the supply closet burst open. It was Chloe, her young face pale and her eyes wide with panic.
Alara, they need everyone. A John Doe came in from that construction site collapse. It's bad. Dr. Finch is in there, but he's coding.
There was a desperate plea in her voice. The ER was a team, and in a moment like this, even the outcast was needed to be an extra pair of hands, to fetch, to carry, to exist on the periphery of the life-saving effort. Alara felt a war raging within her. The part of her that craved anonymity screamed to stay put. But the part of her she had tried to bury, the part that was forged in dust and fire, refused to be silent. It was the oath she had taken, not in a hospital auditorium, but on a windswept tarmac under a sky full of stars. That others may live. The words echoed in her soul. She gave Chloe a short, jerky nod and followed her out of the closet, back into the storm. Trauma Bay 1 was a scene of controlled pandemonium. A dozen people were crammed into the small space, all focused on the man lying on the gurney. He was covered in dust and grime, his clothes torn, a large bloody gash on his forehead. But it was his stillness that was most alarming. He was intubated, a nurse manually bagging him, while another performed chest compressions. Dr. Finch stood at the head of the bed, barking orders, his face a mask of furious concentration. "Push another amp of epi," he shouted. "What's the rhythm?" A resident, his face slick with sweat, called out, "Still asystole, sir." Flatline. Alara stayed near the door, her eyes scanning not the frantic efforts, but the patient himself. It was an automatic process, a diagnostic sweep she couldn't turn off. She took in the dust, the specific gray color of concrete. The mechanism of injury was a crush, a burial. Her gaze moved over his body, cataloging the visible injuries. The head lack, bruises, the distended abdomen. Something was wrong. The scene felt off, the response misdirected. Finch was focused on the cardiac arrest, treating it as the primary event. But Alara's training screamed that a young, healthy-looking man didn't just go into asystole from a crush injury without a clear, catastrophic cause. They were treating the symptom, not the disease. Her eyes narrowed, landing on the man's neck. Beneath the grime, she saw it. It was faint, almost imperceptible to the untrained eye, but to her, it was a blazing red flag. A subtle swelling, a slight discoloration on the right side. And something else. His pupils, when a resident flashed a light in them, were unequal. "He's got a blown pupil. Must be a massive intracranial bleed from the head lack," the resident yelled over the noise. Finch nodded curtly. "Right. It's a brain injury. We're losing him. Call it." He was giving up. He had made his diagnosis based on the most obvious injury and was now resigned to the outcome. His ego wouldn't allow him to consider he might be missing something. To him, the man was already dead. "Time of death, 1432, Finch said, stripping off his gloves with a snap of finality. He turned to the staff. "All right, good effort, everyone. Let's clear the bay. We have other patients who are still alive." His tone was cold, dismissive. The team began to disperse, their shoulders slumped in defeat. The nurse stopped chest compressions. Another silenced the wailing monitors. The room fell into a sudden, heavy silence, broken only by the soft hiss of the ventilator. Alara didn't move. She couldn't. Her feet were rooted to the floor. She stared at the man on the gurney, at the subtle signs her entire being was screaming at her to recognize. The neck swelling, the blown pupil, the specific nature of the dust on his skin. It wasn't a primary brain injury. It wasn't a primary cardiac event. It was something else entirely. Something insidious and rare. Something a civilian doctor like Finch would never have thought to look for. She saw a small, ornate tattoo peeking out from under the collar of his torn shirt. A trident. It was a symbol that jolted her, sending a cascade of memories and protocols through her mind. It wasn't just any man. Her mind raced, connecting the dots with lightning speed. The construction site collapse wasn't just an accident. The crush injury was a cover. The tattoo was a marker. He was one of them. And the symptoms pointed to only one thing: a sophisticated neurotoxin, one designed to mimic the symptoms of a massive head trauma, delivered via a pressure-activated device that would have been triggered by the collapse. It was an assassination. And Finch had just declared the victim dead. Wait. The word escaped her lips, barely a whisper. But in the quiet room, it sounded like a shout. Finch, who was already at the door, turned slowly, his expression one of pure disbelief. "What did you say, Nurse Vance?" Alara felt a dozen pairs of eyes lock onto her. Her camouflage was gone, shredded by a single word. The fear was immense, a cold wave that threatened to drown her. But looking at the still form on the bed, at the trident tattoo, another, stronger feeling took over. It was the old instinct, the duty. She took a step into the room, her voice clearer now, firmer. "Don't call it. You've misdiagnosed him." The silence that followed was absolute. It was as if a bomb had been detonated, and everyone was waiting for the shockwave. Dr. Finch's face went from disbelief to a dark, simmering rage. He walked back towards her, his steps slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. "I have misdiagnosed him?" he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "You, the most incompetent nurse in this entire hospital, who can barely take a blood pressure, are telling me, the head of emergency medicine, that my diagnosis is wrong?" "Yes," Alara said, her chin lifting slightly. She pointed at the gurney. "He doesn't have a fatal brain bleed. He has a tension pneumothorax, compressing his superior vena cava, and he's been exposed to a fast-acting paralytic agent. You're not getting a pulse because the toxin is mimicking brain death, and the pneumo is preventing cardiac return. He's not dead. He's dying." Her words were precise, clinical, devoid of the hesitation and uncertainty that usually colored her speech. They sounded alien coming from her lips, and the staff stared at her as if she had grown a second head. Finch let out a short, barking laugh. It was a sound of pure derision. "A tension pneumothorax and a rare, unnamed paralytic agent? Have you been reading spy novels in the supply closet, Vance? That is the most ridiculous, unsubstantiated fantasy I have ever heard." He gestured expansively to the room. "Look at him. He's gone. You're hysterical." "Check for tracheal deviation," Alara challenged, her voice ringing with an authority that shocked even herself. "Check for subcutaneous emphysema. The signs are there if you look. The dust on his clothes isn't just concrete. It's mixed with a magnesium compound, a dispersal agent. The entry point for the toxin is a microdart in his right trapezius muscle. It's designed to look like a simple abrasion." Finch's face was flushed with anger. He was being challenged, publicly, by the one person he considered beneath contempt. "This is insane. You are having some kind of psychotic break." He turned to the charge nurse. "Brenda, get security up here. Nurse Vance is relieved of her duties, effective immediately. She is a danger to herself and my patients." "There's no time," Alara said, ignoring him. She moved towards the patient, her actions fluid and decisive. The slow, clumsy nurse was gone. In her place was someone else, a woman of terrifying competence. "I need a 14-gauge needle, a large-bore catheter, and a full toxicology kit with a mass spectrometer. Now." Finch physically blocked her path, his body rigid with fury. "You will not touch my patient. Security is on its way. You are fired, Vance. Get out of my ER. Get out of my hospital." His voice was a roar. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Do you understand me? You are finished." The moment his hand closed on her arm, something inside Alara snapped. 2 years of forced meekness, of swallowed insults and feigned incompetence, evaporated in a flash of white-hot anger. Her reaction was not thought, but pure, conditioned reflex. With a twist of her wrist, she broke his grip. In the same fluid motion, she spun, using his momentum against him, and slammed him against the wall. His head hit the plaster with a dull thud. He slid to the floor, stunned and gasping, his eyes wide with shock and pain. The entire room was frozen. Alara stood over the fallen doctor, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with a fire no one had ever seen before. She didn't give him a second glance. She turned back to the patient. "I am not asking," she said, her voice cutting through the air like a scalpel. She locked eyes with Chloe, the terrified young nurse. "The needle, now." Chloe, galvanized by either fear or a sudden, shocking respect, scrambled to a nearby cart and thrust a 14-gauge needle into Alara's outstretched hand. Alara palmed it, her movements economical and sure. She ripped the man's torn shirt open, exposing his chest. She felt for the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line, her fingers finding the landmark with unerring accuracy. She didn't hesitate. She plunged the needle deep into his chest. There was a sudden, explosive hiss of escaping air. It was a sound every person in that room recognized. The sound of a successful needle decompression. The sound of a life being saved. On the monitor, a weak, thready rhythm flickered to life. A single, miraculous beep echoed in the stunned silence. He wasn't dead. She had been right. Before anyone could react, Alara was moving again. She grabbed a scalpel from a tray. "I need to secure an airway below the glottis. The paralytic is affecting his upper respiratory system." She was about to perform a cricothyrotomy, a procedure far beyond the scope of a registered nurse. But before she could make the first cut, the doors to the trauma bay flew open. 2 burly security guards stormed in, their faces grim. Brenda stood behind them, pointing a trembling finger at Alara. "That's her! She assaulted Dr. Finch! She's crazy!" One of the guards grabbed Alara's arm. The scalpel clattered to the floor. "Ma'am, you need to come with us," he said, his voice firm. Alara struggled for a second, her eyes wild. "You don't understand. He'll die," she pleaded, looking at the man on the gurney, his life hanging by a thread she had just barely managed to reattach. But the guards were strong. They dragged her out of the room, past the shocked faces of her colleagues, past the groaning form of Dr. Finch being helped to his feet. She was hauled through the emergency department, a spectacle of shame. "She's fired!" Finch screamed after her, his voice hoarse with rage and humiliation. "Her license is gone. I'll see to it." The guards didn't stop until they reached the main entrance. They pushed her out into the cold, damp air of the late afternoon. One of them shoved her locker key and her purse into her hands. "Don't come back," he grunted, before the glass doors slid shut, sealing her out. Alara stood on the pavement, trembling. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a profound, hollow despair. Rain began to fall, cold and miserable, soaking her thin scrubs. She had done it. She had broken her 2 years of silence, destroyed her carefully constructed camouflage, all for a man she didn't know. A man who was probably going to die anyway, now that she was gone. Finch, his ego wounded, would never admit she was right. He would let the man die to prove his point. She had lost everything. Her job, her anonymity, the quiet life she had sacrificed so much to build. All gone. She had nowhere to go. No one to call. The ghost she had been running from felt closer now than ever before. Defeated, she turned and started walking, with no destination in mind, the cold rain plastering her hair to her face. She decided to just leave the city, to run again. The airport was her only thought. A new name, a new place, a new attempt at being invisible. The airport was a blur of fluorescent lights and anxious energy. Alara moved through it like a wraith, her damp scrubs clinging to her skin, her face a pale, emotionless mask. She used the last of her cash to buy a one-way ticket to the furthest, most obscure destination on the board. A small town in Oregon she'd never heard of. It was as good a place as any to disappear. She passed through security in a daze, the TSA agents giving her odd looks but waving her through. She found her gate and slumped into a hard plastic chair, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. She had failed. She had run from her past, only to have it hunt her down in a hospital trauma bay. She had tried to save a man and had been thrown out like garbage for her efforts. He was surely dead by now. And Dr. Finch would write the official report, a work of fiction that would paint her as an unstable, violent employee and him as the victim. Her career was over. Her life as Alara Vance was over. As she sat there, drowning in self-pity, her old training kicked in, a defense mechanism against the overwhelming despair. She started scanning the crowd. It was an old habit, one she had never been able to break. Assess the environment, identify threats, note exits. Her eyes swept over the faces in the waiting area. Businessmen on laptops, families with crying children, students with backpacks. Nothing out of the ordinary. Then she saw them. Two men standing near the newsstand. They didn't fit. They were trying to look casual, but their posture was all wrong. It was too rigid, too alert. They wore plain, functional clothes, but their shoes were expensive, military-style boots. Their eyes weren't browsing magazines. They were sweeping the gate area, a practiced, predatory surveillance pattern. One of them spoke quietly into his cuff, a classic sign of a concealed communication device. Alara's blood ran cold. They weren't TSA. They weren't airport police. They were operators, and they were looking for someone. Her eyes darted around the room, trying to see what they saw. Was there a dignitary on this flight? A wanted fugitive? Then her gaze fell on a third man, sitting a few rows away from her. He was pretending to read a newspaper, but he was holding it upside down. He had the same rigid posture, the same alert eyes, and she noticed a small, telltale bulge under the left side of his jacket. They were a team. A hunter team. Her mind raced. Why here? Why this gate? It couldn't be a coincidence. Her flight to nowhere. The men looking for someone. And the man in the hospital. The man with the trident tattoo. They weren't here for her. They were here to make sure the job was finished. They must have learned that their target had survived the initial attempt. They were here to intercept anyone connected to him. Or perhaps they had a secondary target. Or worse, they were here to find out where he had been taken. She had to do something. She couldn't call the police. What would she say? There are some serious-looking men at my gate? They would dismiss her as a crank, especially in her current state. She had no proof, only a gut feeling honed by years of life-or-death experience. She had to send a signal, one that would be understood by the right people, and only the right people. She stood up and walked towards the large windows overlooking the tarmac. She kept her back to the men, but she could feel their eyes on her. She pulled her phone from her purse, pretending to make a call. Using the reflection in the glass, she watched them. One of them was looking directly at her. He had noticed her strange, damp clothes, her tense posture. He was assessing her as a potential threat. She had to act now. She turned her body slightly, as if stretching. With her left hand held low against her leg, she made a series of small, precise gestures. It was a silent, coded language, a variation of hand signals used by special operations units to communicate in hostile territory without breaking radio silence. It was a language she was fluent in. She signed, "Compromised. Hostile operators present. Trident. I am a friendly. Require immediate assistance." It was a wild gamble, a desperate, hopeless prayer sent out into the void. She had no idea if anyone was watching, if anyone was there to even receive the message. She finished the signal and turned away from the window, her heart pounding against her ribs. She started walking back towards her seat, expecting a hand to clamp down on her shoulder, expecting the end. She sat down, her hands trembling in her lap. She waited. 1 minute passed. Then 2. The men were still there, still watching. One of them was speaking into his cuff again, his expression more intense now. Had they seen her? Did they understand? Or did they just mark her as a suspicious person to be dealt with? Suddenly, the calm of the terminal was shattered. From every direction, men in dark blue uniforms and tactical gear materialized. They moved with a silent, terrifying efficiency. They weren't airport police. The patches on their arms read, Naval Security. They swarmed the gate area, creating a perimeter, their weapons held at a low ready. Passengers gasped and scrambled out of the way. The 3 men Alara had spotted tensed. They exchanged a look. For a split second, they considered making a move, but they were hopelessly outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The Naval security team converged on them, and in a matter of seconds, all 3 were disarmed and forced to the ground, their faces pressed into the industrial carpet. It was over before it even began. The terminal was in chaos, but Alara sat perfectly still. In the middle of the controlled storm stood a man who had not been there a moment before. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore the crisp uniform of a high-ranking naval officer. His face was weathered and stern, his eyes sharp and intelligent. He scanned the crowd, his gaze passing over the frightened faces of the passengers until it landed on her. He walked directly towards her, his boots making no sound on the floor. He stopped in front of her chair. He didn't look at her with suspicion or confusion. He looked at her with a mixture of awe and profound relief. "We received your signal," he said, his voice a deep, commanding baritone. "We weren't sure we read it right. A ghost transmission from an asset we thought was long gone." He studied her face, his eyes lingering on the faint scar near her temple. "I'm Rear Admiral Caldwell. We've been looking for Captain Thorne. Your signal is the only reason we found him before it was too late." Alara stared up at him, speechless. Captain Thorne. So the John Doe had a name and a rank. "He's alive," she managed to whisper, her voice choked with emotion. "I stabilized him, but the doctor, he threw me out. He wouldn't listen." Admiral Caldwell's jaw tightened. "We know. We've been monitoring the situation since Captain Thorne missed his check-in. We had a team outside the hospital, but we couldn't move in without confirmation. Your actions inside that ER bought him the time he needed." He offered her a hand. "But he's not out of the woods. The man who did this to him, Dr. Finch, he's still in there. And we believe the toxin requires a very specific, classified antidote. An antidote you might know how to administer. We need you, Sergeant. Your country needs you." He had called her Sergeant. He knew who she was, not Nurse Vance, the clumsy mouse. He knew her real name, her real rank, her real history. The past she had tried so desperately to bury had not only found her, it had come to rescue her. She took his hand, and he pulled her to her feet. The cold, wet scrubs suddenly felt like a costume she could finally shed. For the first time in 2 years, Alara Vance stood up straight, her shoulders back, her gaze clear and steady. The ghost was gone. The soldier had returned. "What are your orders, Admiral?" she asked, her voice ringing with the forgotten steel of command. The ride back to City General was a high-speed blur of sirens and flashing lights. Alara sat in the back of a black-armored SUV, flanked by 2 stone-faced SEALs. Admiral Caldwell sat opposite her, briefing her on the situation. Captain Marcus Thorne was not just a SEAL. He was the leader of a top-tier special missions unit. He had been in the city to quietly retrieve intelligence from a compromised source regarding a planned chemical attack on a naval base. The intelligence was believed to be stored on a microdrive he carried, but more importantly, he held key information in his memory. His survival was a matter of national security. "The men at the airport were part of the same cell that targeted him," Caldwell explained, his voice grim. "They're private military contractors working for a rogue chemical weapons developer. They wanted Thorne dead to cover their tracks and prevent him from exposing their network. When the initial attempt failed, they activated their inside man." He paused, letting the weight of his next words sink in. "We have reason to believe their man on the inside is Dr. Alistair Finch." Alara felt a cold knot of understanding form in her stomach. It wasn't just ego. It wasn't just arrogance. Finch's refusal to listen, his rush to declare Thorne dead, his violent reaction to being challenged. It was all a calculated act. He had been paid to ensure that John Doe never left the morgue. Her defiance hadn't just wounded his pride. It had threatened his entire corrupt arrangement. "He'll try again," Alara said, her voice low. "He knows the hospital's protocols. It's blind spots. He can get to Thorne." "Which is why we're going in hard and fast," Caldwell replied. "My team will secure Thorne and the entire floor. Your job is to keep him alive. We have the antidote. It's a 2-component agent, but the delivery system is complex and requires precise titration based on the patient's metabolic response. The file says there are only a handful of medics in the world trained on it. You're one of them." The SUV screeched to a halt at the ambulance bay of the ER. The scene was one of utter pandemonium. Naval security teams had already established a perimeter. Hospital staff were being herded away from the entrance, their faces a mixture of fear and confusion. Alara stepped out of the vehicle, flanked by the Admiral and her SEAL escort. She saw Brenda and some of the other nurses staring, their mouths agape. They looked at her, then at the heavily armed men surrounding her, their minds unable to process the scene. They stormed into the ER, their boots clattering on the linoleum. Dr. Finch was in the main corridor, shouting at a young naval officer. "You can't do this! This is a hospital! I am in charge here!" he bellowed, his face purple with rage. Then he saw Alara. His tirade died in his throat. He stared at her position in the center of the military formation, and his expression shifted from fury to pure, unadulterated shock. Admiral Caldwell stepped forward, his presence radiating an authority that dwarfed Finch's. "Dr. Alistair Finch," he said, his voice cold and hard as iron. "You are being relieved of your duties under the authority of the National Security Act. My medic is now in charge of the patient you left for dead." He gestured towards Alara. Finch's eyes darted between the Admiral and Alara, his mind scrambling to comprehend the reversal of fortune. Her? A medic? She's a fired nurse. She's unstable. She assaulted me, he sputtered, pointing a trembling finger at Alara. "She is former Air Force Pararescue Sergeant Alara Vance," Caldwell stated, his voice cutting through Finch's blustering. "A decorated combat medic with more life-saving citations than your entire department combined. And you, Doctor, are a person of interest in the attempted murder of a United States naval officer." Two armed sailors stepped forward and flanked Finch, their faces impassive. Finch's face went pale. The color drained from his skin, leaving him looking sallow and old under the harsh hospital lights. Alara didn't spare him another glance. Her focus was entirely on the mission. "Where is he?" she demanded. Chloe, the young nurse, suddenly appeared at her side, her eyes wide with awe. "They took him to the ICU, room 4, she whispered. "Finch said it was to harvest his organs for donation." The lie was so monstrous it took Alara's breath away. He was going to let him die, and then mutilate his body to hide the evidence of the toxin. "Clear a path," Alara ordered, her voice resonating with command. The SEALs formed a wedge around her, and they moved through the crowded hallways towards the ICU. They reached room 4, where two of Finch's most loyal residents stood guard, looking nervous. "Get out of the way," Alara snapped. They practically dove aside. Inside, Captain Thorne was as she had left him, only worse. His vitals were crashing again. The temporary fix of the needle decompression was failing. He was running out of time. "Get me the antidote kit and a full crash cart," she commanded. The ICU nurses, seeing the SEALs and the Admiral, and hearing the tone in Alara's voice, didn't question her. They flew into action. Alara worked with a speed and precision that was breathtaking to watch. She inserted a chest tube with the skill of a seasoned surgeon, stabilizing his breathing. She established new, large-bore IV lines, her hands a blur of practiced motion. When the antidote kit arrived, she opened it, her eyes scanning the complex array of vials and injectors. She knew this kit. She had trained with it in a secret facility in the Nevada desert, preparing for a threat that was only whispered about in intelligence circles. "I need real-time metabolic panel readouts," she said, not looking up from her work. "Every 60 seconds. A nurse quickly connected the lab interface to the monitor. Alara began mixing the first component of the antidote, her calculations swift and precise. She was no longer just a medic. She was a scientist, a warrior, a protector, all rolled into one. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. As she was about to administer the first dose, a sudden commotion erupted outside the room. A gunshot rang out, followed by shouting. The SEALs in the room immediately took defensive positions, their weapons raised. Admiral Caldwell spoke into his wristcom. "Status?" The reply was grim. "Contact! We have an active shooter on the floor. Finch got a weapon off one of the hospital police." Alara's head snapped up. Finch. He was making his last, desperate move. "He's not trying to escape," she said, her voice tight. "He's coming to finish the job." The lights in the ICU suddenly flickered and died, plunging the room into the dim, eerie glow of the emergency backup lights. The monitors, running on battery power, cast a sickly green light on Captain Thorne's pale face. "They've cut the main power," one of the SEALs growled. "They're trying to isolate us." Alara knew they couldn't move Thorne in his condition. They were trapped. She administered the first dose of the antidote, her hands steadied despite the chaos. "That will start to counteract the paralytic, but he's incredibly vulnerable right now. We have to protect him here." Another gunshot, this one closer. The glass window of the ICU room door shattered. A nurse screamed. "He's in the hall!" Chloe yelled, huddled behind a supply cart. Finch was out there, armed and desperate. And he had an accomplice. The shooter wasn't just him. The attack was coordinated. The men from the airport were just the first wave. The Admiral looked at Alara. "The hospital is compromised. We need to get him out of here. Now!" Alara shook her head. "Moving him is a death sentence. The antidote needs time, and I need this equipment." "Then we hold this room," the lead SEAL said, his voice a low growl. He and his partner moved to flank the door, their rifles pointed at the entrance. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. The only sounds were the steady beeping of the heart monitor, the hiss of the ventilator, and their own ragged breathing. A smoke grenade clattered into the hallway outside, and the corridor filled with thick white smoke. Through the haze, two figures emerged, wearing hospital scrubs as a disguise. They opened fire, their weapons suppressed, spitting silent death at the ICU door. The SEALs returned fire, the roar of their rifles deafening in the enclosed space. Alara never took her eyes off her patient. She was preparing the second dose of the antidote, her movements still precise, her focus absolute. She was in her element. The chaos, the gunfire, the imminent danger, it was all just noise. The only thing that mattered was the man on the bed, the mission. She was a pararescueman. This was her calling. One of the SEALs grunted in pain, stumbling back from the door. He'd been hit in the leg. "They're trying to flank us from the service corridor," he yelled. They were being boxed in. The Admiral drew his sidearm, his face a grim mask. "We can't hold out for long. Reinforcements are 5 minutes out." 5 minutes was an eternity. Alara finished preparing the dose. She administered it, her eyes locked on the monitor, watching for the change, the sign that it was working. Thorne's heart rate began to stabilize. His blood pressure ticked slowly upward. It was working. But they were out of time. Suddenly, a side door to the ICU, one that led to a small storage room, burst open. It was Finch. His face was contorted in a mask of crazed desperation, his eyes wild. He held a pistol in a shaking hand, and he was pointing it directly at Captain Thorne. "If I'm going down," he hissed, "he's coming with me." Before the SEALs or the Admiral could react, Alara moved. She didn't think, she acted. She grabbed a heavy, stainless steel defibrillator paddle from the crash cart and threw it with all her might. The heavy object flew through the air and struck Finch squarely in the side of the head. The gun went off, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the ceiling. Finch staggered, dropping the weapon, his eyes rolling back in his head as he collapsed to the floor, unconscious. In the stunned silence that followed, the sounds of heavy boots and shouted commands echoed from the hallway. The Admiral's reinforcements had arrived. The siege was over. Alara stood over Finch's unconscious form, her chest heaving, the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Then she turned back to her patient. Captain Thorne's eyes were open, just a slit. He was looking at her. His lips moved, but no sound came out. But she could read them. "Thank you." They moved Captain Thorne to a secure military medical facility outside the city. Alara went with them, refusing to leave his side until he was fully stable. For the next 48 hours, she didn't sleep. She worked alongside a team of military doctors, her expertise on the toxin and its antidote proving invaluable. She monitored his progress, adjusted his treatment, and watched as he slowly, miraculously, pulled back from the brink of death. On the third day, Admiral Caldwell found her in the small, sterile hospital cafeteria, staring into a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. "He's going to make a full recovery," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "The doctors are calling it a miracle. I know better. It was you, Sergeant." Alara just nodded, too exhausted to speak. "Finch is in federal custody," the Admiral continued. "He's confessed to everything. He was deeply in debt and was offered a small fortune to make sure Thorne died on his operating table. He's implicated the entire network. Thanks to you and the intelligence Thorne was carrying, we're rolling them up as we speak. You didn't just save one man's life, Alara. You saved hundreds, maybe thousands." He slid a file across the table to her. "Your file. It's been reactivated. The Air Force has retroactively changed your discharge from medical to honorable. Your full rank and privileges have been reinstated." Alara stared at the file, at her own name on the cover. It felt like looking at a stranger. "I can't go back," she whispered. "That life. I left it behind for a reason." "I'm not asking you to go back," Caldwell said gently. "I'm asking you to move forward. We're putting together a new unit, a rapid response medical team, attached directly to Naval Special Warfare. It'll be tasked with operating in unconventional environments, handling threats like the one we just faced. It needs a leader, someone with a unique skill set, someone who knows both medicine and combat. Someone who knows what it's like to be a ghost. He tapped the file. The job is yours, if you want it. It was everything she had run from, and everything she was. A chance not to hide, but to use her skills, her scars, for something that mattered. A chance to be herself, finally and completely. A week later, Captain Marcus Thorne was sitting up in his hospital bed when Alara came to see him. The tubes and wires were gone, and the color had returned to his face. He smiled when he saw her. "I was hoping I'd get to see my guardian angel before they let me out of here," he said, his voice still a little rough. Alara felt a blush creep up her neck. "Just doing my job, Captain. My friends call me Marcus," he said, "and I'd say you went a little above and beyond the job description." He looked at her, his gaze direct and filled with a gratitude so profound it made her heart ache. "The Admiral told me what you did. In the ER, at the airport, all of it. You saved my life, more than once." "You would have done the same," she said softly. It was the truth. It was the code they both lived by. "The Admiral also told me he offered you a job," Marcus said, a hopeful glint in his eye. "I hope you took it. It would be a shame to let all that talent go to waste restocking supply closets. Besides," he added, his smile widening, "it would give me a chance to thank you properly. Maybe over dinner, once I'm cleared for solid food." Alara looked at him, at this man whose life was now inextricably linked with hers. She thought of the quiet, miserable life she had been living, the constant fear, the self-imposed prison of anonymity, and she thought of the future the Admiral was offering her, a future of purpose, of service, of honor, a future where she didn't have to hide. She smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I'll think about it," she said, but they both knew she had already made her decision. The final scene unfolded not in a hospital, but in the bustling lobby of City General. A press conference was underway. The hospital board, looking pale and shaken, had just finished issuing a public apology. The news of Dr. Finch's crimes had sent shockwaves through the city. As cameras flashed, Admiral Caldwell stepped up to the podium. He spoke of heroism, not just overseas, but here at home. He spoke of a medic whose courage and skill had averted a national tragedy. And then he called her name. "Sergeant Alara Vance." Alara, dressed not in scrubs but in a crisp Air Force dress uniform, stepped forward. Her colleagues from the ER were in the crowd. She saw Chloe, beaming, tears of pride in her eyes. She saw Brenda and the others, their faces a mixture of shame and disbelief. They applauded, first hesitantly, then with genuine enthusiasm. They were applauding the hero, the woman they had never bothered to see. She kept her remarks brief, speaking of duty and the importance of doing the right thing, no matter the cost. As she stepped away from the podium, her old life fell away like a discarded skin. She walked out of the hospital, not as a disgraced outcast, but as a recognized hero. Outside, the sun was shining. Marcus Thorne was waiting for her, leaning against a black government car, a cane at his side, but a strong smile on his face. He opened the door for her. "Ready to go, Sergeant?" he asked. "Call me Alara," she said, sliding into the car. As they drove away, she didn't look back at the hospital, at the life of shadows she was leaving behind. She looked forward, at the open road ahead, ready for the next mission, ready for her new life. The quiet was over, and she was glad. We really hope you enjoyed this educational piece of content, and hope that you could understand the moral lessons behind it. The story of Alara Vance is a powerful reminder that we should never judge a book by its cover. People who seem quiet or meek on the outside may possess incredible strength and courage on the inside. True character is revealed not by a person's title or position, but by their actions in a moment of crisis. Alara was dismissed and humiliated, but when it mattered most, her true self, a dedicated and highly skilled hero, shone through. It teaches us that doing the right thing, even when it's hard and comes at a great personal cost, is always the right choice. In the end, her integrity and bravery were rewarded, and the arrogant antagonist who abused his power faced the justice he deserved. True strength is not about being the loudest voice in the room, but about having the courage to speak up for what is right, even when your voice shakes. What would you have done if you were in Alara's shoes? Would you have risked everything to save a stranger, even if it meant facing the wrath of your powerful boss? Let me know in the comments below. We love hearing your thoughts and opinions on these moral dilemmas.
And if you enjoyed this story and the lessons it shared, please don't forget to smash that like button. It really helps the channel out and lets us know you want more content like this. Also, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story upload. We have many more inspirational and educational stories coming your way. Have a nice rest of your day.